Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the European Union has radically reduced its imports of coal, oil and natural gas from Russia. In fact, the bloc's stated goal is to eliminate all Russian fossil fuel imports by 2027. But there is one glaring exception to this trend: liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which the EU has been importing in record volumes from Russia. DW's Jack Parrock reports.
An embarrassing fact for the EU. The bloc is Russia's biggest customer of liquefied natural gas, buying over half of the country's supply in the first 7 months of the year. That's worth over €5 billion, potentially sustaining the Kremlin's war chest.
For Russia, it means that European Union and countries which basically are purchasing Russian gas, basically they're helping to finance Russia's budget and at the same moment finance Russia's aggression and war against Ukraine.
LNG is natural gas which has been turned into liquid form to be transported around the world in ships, rather than down pipelines. It's 600 times smaller in volume. Most of the Russian LNG entering Europe enters ports in Belgium, France and Spain, but it doesn't all stay in Europe.
The cargo is moved from one ship either to another ship or to a storage site in the port, and then is sent, dispatched somewhere else, either in Europe or towards Asian markets or the Middle East. It depends.
Much of the gas stays in Europe, though, and is delivered to other EU nations. Pressure has mounted on European port terminals to stop accepting Russian LNG imports. Fluxys, which runs the terminal in Belgium's Zeebrugge port, told DW they're based on a principle of open access as an essential service, meaning they can't legally deny any client access, even Russian shipments.
The EU has already sanctioned imports of Russian oil and coal, greatly reducing the quantities coming in. Experts we've spoken to say that until the EU decides to sanction gas, those imports are unlikely to go down.
In Brussels, the European Commission says it wants LNG purchases from Russia to end, but says overall gas imports, LNG and pipeline form, are down from 40% before the invasion to 15% now.
You know, some companies are tied into long-term contracts, and we've encouraged them to bring those to a close as soon as possible and to not renew those. So yeah, I mean, the political message from the Commission is very clear. The sooner we can get rid of the Russian LNG imports, the better, but that will take a little bit of time still.
The EU has celebrated the fact it's managed to get gas storage to 90% with the winter coming, but a chunk of that has come from Russia.
To talk more about this, I'm joined now by Carole Nakhle, founder and CEO of Crystol Energy, a consulting group. She's joining us from Abu Dhabi. Carole, I want to understand this better. How important is LNG for the EU in general?
LNG has saved the EU from a big crisis last year because the EU traditionally used to rely on pipeline gas, which is a very rigid infrastructure because it connects one supplier with a specific endpoint that is a customer. But LNG gives flexibility to both actually the producer and the consumer. And the consumer is in the case of the EU. So when the crisis happened last year and Russia cut a lot of its supplies, gas supplies to the EU by pipeline, we found that LNG saved the day. Yes, prices increased, but it was that price signal that was necessary to attract these additional supplies of LNG. And towards the autumn of last year, we saw LNG tankers queuing at some ports in Europe to deliver liquefied natural gas to a very important market that is the EU. So I think without LNG, we would have seen prices much higher last year in Europe, and the crisis would have lasted much longer.
OK, so we know that LNG is really important to the EU right now, but Russia is its second largest supplier after the United States. Given that the EU does have a big and reliable supplier in America, why has it been buying more from Russia?
Well, we have to acknowledge that Russia continues to be an important supplier of natural gas to the EU. Of course, its share dropped dramatically between 2021 and 2022, but still, while pipeline gas shrunk a lot, it was able to compensate to a certain extent by LNG. Now, of course, you might say, while we're still buying LNG, at the end, you have to cater to the needs of the local market. And the difference between LNG and pipeline is that you can get it from different sources, but you have to take into consideration what is available out there. It's not easy to open the tap and close the tap and send a ship of LNG to a market. So most of LNG that you see traded today, it's usually contracted between the producer and the customer for many years to come. You're talking about 15 years or 20 years. There is a smaller proportion of LNG that is traded without these long-term contracts, what we call spot LNG. And few players still have that spot LNG available. The US is the main one, but very few around. And Russia is stepping in to take advantage of this flexibility that LNG is giving to Europe and the need for LNG in the EU.
So on that question of eliminating Russian fossil fuel imports entirely by 2027, what needs to happen in the next 4 years for that to become a reality?
I mean, the main thing would be to build the infrastructure and expand the infrastructure to, first of all, be able to absorb different sources of supplies. Now, LNG terminals, the EU by itself, it has well-established infrastructure in that respect, and they have been working on it for years, if not decades. But you are still limited in terms of importing capacity, because each terminal has a certain capacity to import certain volumes of liquefied natural gas. So you have to build more LNG terminals and expand the capacity of existing ones where possible, but also consider connection ways between different countries and different players. And one of the problems that we saw in the EU last year is this limited import capacity. So, for example, there were LNG tankers queuing at certain ports because the market could not absorb the volumes that came all at once because of the higher prices. So that is an important aspect. But don't forget, we're talking about diversifying sources of gas, from pipeline gas to LNG primarily, and different sources of LNG suppliers. But you have also to think about diversifying sources of energy. So this is where the EU, between now and 2027 or 2030, they will have to also accelerate investment in alternative energy. So at the end, you have diversification of energy supplies, but also energy sources.
Carole Nakhle, founder and CEO of Crystol Energy, thank you very much.
Thank you.